They thought she had fainted because the blood didn't show on red. In a crowded university library, a 22-year-old grad student is stabbed once, silently, and the killer vanishes in seconds among metal stacks designed to make footsteps echo. This isn't folklore, it happened, and it's still unsolved. On the Friday after Thanksgiving, November 28, 1969, Pattee Library at Penn State was supposed to be quiet, a sanctuary for students catching up before finals, a place where the loudest sound was the thud of a book reshelved one floor above. At 4:30 p.m., graduate student Betsy Aardsma walked into that sanctuary wearing a red sweater and a red dress, the color a small human decision that, without her knowing, would soon camouflage a mortal wound in plain sight. Within an hour, she would be dead, and the case would become one of the most haunting unsolved murders in American campus history. The stacks at Pattee weren't ordinary aisles. They were metal mezzanines, partially see-through, the kind of industrial lattice that lets light and sound travel strangely, making whispered voices and hurried steps bounce in confusing directions. Detectives would later fixate on that architecture because it both reveals and conceals. The floors let one see between levels, the footsteps carry, and yet sight lines break every few feet in a maze of spines and steel. If a killer wanted to disappear, this labyrinth offered both cover and contradiction. The library was crowded, and still, no one heard a scream. Betsy was 22, a Michigan native and an English graduate student, by all accounts steady, diligent, and not in obvious danger. She had a boyfriend, sent letters home, and kept a schedule that wouldn't raise eyebrows. That ordinariness is what makes the crime feel impossible. The quintessential locked room atmosphere, but in an open public space where entry and exit were supposed to be visible, if not audible. The first witnesses to reach her thought she had fainted. They tried to help, but the red sweater masked the blood, and vital early moments of the scene were lost to confusion and human concern. Investigators would later note a man hurrying out, reported by a student who followed him, and yet no one would ever be charged. The knife was never recovered. In the hours and days after, tips poured in and then fell away. A young woman died in a place designed for learning and safety, and the case slipped into that cruel liminal space, forever urgent, forever unsolved. This is a detective puzzle locked behind stacks of books, and to move it forward, the scene itself must be reconstructed. It's late afternoon, post-holiday, with the campus in a semi-lull. The metal stacks are notorious. Multiple levels, partially transparent floors, and a geometry that makes footsteps ring out like clues, yet makes directionality slippery. One writer who toured similar stacks described how they rise in levels, bearing the weight of millions of volumes, so a person can be alone in a crowd, exposed yet hidden. That paradox forms the spine of our mystery. The official record is stark. Betsy was stabbed once in the chest, one precise wound that caused her to bleed into her lungs. She likely grasped for a shelf, dislodging books that clattered down, drawing attention only after the violence was already over. Students arrived, misreading the scene as a fainting spell, and in that compassionate rush, the sight was inadvertently disturbed. The red clothing masked blood and delayed recognition of the crime. Crucial time was lost. When the truth dawned, panic rippled outward, but the killer had already melted into the stacks, or down a stairwell, or out into the early winter dark. Real-world dates and anchors matter in cold cases like this. The murder occurred November 28, 1969, at Penn State's Pattee Library, a detail repeated in newspapers, books, and anniversary features as the years ticked past. 39 years, 52 years, and now more than 5 decades without an arrest. Reported sightings included one or possibly two suspicious men around the time of the stabbing, and a man seen hurrying away, followed briefly by a student. Yet police never recovered the knife, and no suspect was publicly named in a way that led to charges. The investigative tide surged, then receded, leaving questions behind like silt. Two tension peaks define this act. First, the near silence of the attack itself. No scream reported, no commotion until books fell. Imagine standing one aisle over, hearing only the metallic echo of a single hurried step, or nothing at all, because in a library, people train themselves not to notice minor sounds. The killer exploited a culture of quiet. Second, the red-on-red concealment. The detail feels like fate, but it was physics and fabric. The color hid the blood just long enough to confuse the scene and, maybe, save the killer's lead time by precious minutes. As for motives, theories multiplied. Some whispered that she interrupted a clandestine meeting, perhaps involving drugs or a private rendezvous. Others wondered if the killer knew her, or if this was a random act by a stranger who understood the stack's acoustics and escape routes. Over the decades, authors and journalists revisited the case, emphasizing its chilling simplicity and the absence of resolution. In interviews promoting a detailed account, one writer underlined the challenges: no weapon, muddled early scene, suspect descriptions too thin to convert to charges. The longer a case lives in file boxes, the more it calcifies into community folklore. Record keepers and cold case retrospectives return to the same fragments: the time after Thanksgiving, the echoing stacks, the single fatal wound, the man seen leaving, the lack of an arrest, in a community that still whispers the story to each new generation. Even national outlets commemorated the case's anniversaries, half a century of grief compressed into a paragraph. The photograph of a young woman whose life became shorthand for a question police could not answer. In another register, scholars of mystery fiction point to libraries and stacks as idealized stages for impossible crimes. The way the built environment constricts possibilities and teases investigators with false impossibilities. A century of detective writing has mapped the trope: sanctuaries turned grotesque by a body among books, architecture that shapes alibis and misdirection. Yet here in a real library, the impossibility was social, not magical. The killer didn't walk through walls. He walked through norms. A public space is only as safe as the social norms allow, and the norm in a library is reflection, not alarm. In 1969, as now, students assume safety in shared silence. That assumption lulls vigilance and, in rare, terrible moments, delays detection. The library's very virtues, order, quiet, routine, became part of the method. That is not victim blaming, it is environment analysis. A single targeted act can exploit a place's etiquette. Twist 1. What looks like an impossible murder in a maze might instead be the fastest kind of crime. A single practiced thrust that relies on seconds, not minutes, and on how humans respond to distress in public. Witnesses thought Betsy fainted. Help arrived with good intentions. The scene was moved in small, earnest ways. That wasn't incompetence, it was compassion colliding with confusion. The killer needed only that, an interval measured in breaths, to vanish. Twist 2. The architecture is not an accomplice but a decoy. Investigators and commentators fixated rightly on the metallic stacks, the sound they transmit, and the sightlines they break. But the hard truth is that in a crowded public space with multiple exit paths, anonymity is the perfect disguise. The stacks did not swallow the killer, the crowd did. A man hurrying out is hardly suspicious on a campus Friday. People hurry everywhere. Without a weapon, without a scream, and with a victim whose clothing disguised the crime, the killer walked, not warped, out of view. The main resolution is, candidly, unresolved. No arrest, no named suspect, no recovered knife. But in narrative terms, the reveal is the method and the misdirection. This wasn't a Baroque magician's trick. It was the minimalism of violence, the precision of a single thrust delivered at close range in a narrow aisle where approach is masked by the expectation of study and silence. Afterwards, the killer moved quickly but not theatrically, down a stairwell or across a level, merging with students who were juggling backpacks and term papers. The case became impossible not because the room was locked, but because the social contract was open. Immediate aftermath stretched into decades. The campus remembered, articles marked the anniversaries, 39 years, 52 years, and public attention spiked and dipped like a heart monitor. Investigators fielded and exhausted leads. Authors wrote and rewrote the file in long form. True crime listeners learned the name Betsy Aardsma as shorthand for a library-turned-crime scene. Each retelling returns to the same touchstones: the time and place, the red sweater, the metal stacks, the vanishing suspect, the missing knife, the silence where a scream should have been. Over half a century later, the murder of Betsy Aardsma still haunts State College, a communal ghost that lives in every orientation tour and every whispered warning among the stacks. The legal impact is a void, no arrest, and the social impact is a scar that reshaped how libraries and campuses think about public safety, surveillance, and response in spaces that are, by design, quiet and trusting. That tension, openness versus vigilance, remains unresolved because sanctuaries feel less like sanctuaries if they bristle with suspicion. A moral question lingers. How do communities honor the dead and learn from the failure to secure justice without surrendering the very qualities, quiet, access, trust, that make a library a public good? Maybe the answer is attention without paranoia, training without fear, and a promise that silence will never again mask urgency. The story is strange, dark, and profoundly human, not because of a mastermind's flair, but because ordinary people did ordinary things while evil took the smallest possible window.
Don't forget to subscribe to Real Mystery Reports for more strange, dark, and profoundly human stories. New true mysteries every day.